All right.
Yeah.
So where and when were you born? I know New Mexico.
No, actually, I was born in South Texas. I was born in McAllen, Texas, which is now in the news as a border town with Reynosa, Mexico. And but the family didn't live there long, and my early years were spent moving around. My family was rather nomadic my early years, and we lived in a number of different places, probably up through the second grade. I lived in El Paso mostly, and then moved to New Mexico. So I moved to New Mexico right in the second grade, moving to the third grade, and to Little Town, which is, I think, because the rest was sort of a blur. My sense of childhood and place is really Las Vegas, New Mexico, which is a little town northeast of Santa Fe, the original Las Vegas, as people there like to say.
Yeah.
And it was a unique and wonderful place to grow up.
I can imagine roaming the hills and, exploring the desert and being outside a lot.
Yeah, Las Vegas actually is in the foot of Crystal Mountains, so I spent a lot of time in the mountains as a kid. I saw your interview with Larry Dossie, and he and I covered a lot of the same territory out there in the northern New Mexico mountains, and so I have a great love for it and spent a lot of time there as a kid.
Right.
I didn't live on a ranch. I lived in town, but I spent a lot of time outdoors.
Right. What month were you born? I'm interested in your astrological sign.
Oh, well, it's January 24th. I don't know a lot about astrology, but I know
Aquarius.
Aquarian.
Yeah. What I don't know that much, but I know Aquarians are really future thinking and progressive and kind of hard to pin down. So
Well, I've always felt a certain affinity with that. I think I've always tended to be kind of broadly curious and interested in things that other people didn't seem to find that interesting.
Mm-hmm. Do you know your Myers?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We'll get both those. Do you know your Myers-Briggs, your Enneagram, your other personality types that are fun?
I don't know the Enneagram. I've taken the Myers-Briggs and other Jung tests several times. I come out INFP, or sometimes I'll come out INTP. T and F are pretty balanced for me.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting to me that did you, as a P, did you have to struggle with graduate school deadlines and structures? Because P's don't like to be boxed into that kind of rigidity.
Oh yeah. That's always been a struggle. Has always been a weak suit and always been sort of a work in progress for me.
It got garbled. What did you say? They got garbled when you said it's always. I don't know what was a weak suit.
It's always been a weak.
What?
Like a bridge hand. Order and organization and dealing with structure.
Got it.
It's always been a challenge.
Got it.
I've gotten better over the years because I worked at it so darn hard.
Right.
But I can't say it's basically any easier than it ever has been. I'm pretty extreme on the P and pretty extreme on the N. I'm very Myers-Briggs type. In Jungian terms, I'm very intuitive and perceptive type.
Yeah. That fits with your work.
Certainly more intuitive story.
When you're working with, say, couples do you like to give them a personality inventory like the Myers-Briggs or something so they understand each other better?
No, I don't. I don't do any formal testing and haven't in years, but I'll see that people are clearly this or that and give them some feedback about what that implies and what challenges it implies, what strength it implies, and how they might use that to communicate better.
Yeah, what I like about the Myers-Briggs is it takes away any kind of judgment. It's like it's not better to be a P or a J, and I think that's very helpful.
Oh yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
Sure. And the same thing parents dealing with their children, it's good to, I think in terms of temperament a fair amount too. We all have temperaments, ways we're wired, and to give a sort of value neutral idea about temperament to people so that they're not so frightened by, say, differences that might occur with their children who just happen to turn out to be different temperaments than they are. A lot of things that people consider problems with children really turn out just to be temperamental differences. And if you can understand it that way, it takes the conflict out sometimes.
What are examples of the names for different kinds of temperaments that parents may not understand?
There are dimensions of temperament. There are one I think is interesting, slower. So these things turn out practically out of the crib. You see them throughout a lifetime, but some kids will always jump right into a group of strangers and find themselves in the middle and be very active and just from the word go. Some other kids will linger on the edge for a long time and watch and then eventually find a way to enter in. And that's one dimension of temperament, this how quickly we warm up. They'll in the same place, they'll both end up finding ways to relate. But they have a different pace at that early thing. And some kids are more anxious, some kids are less anxious. Some kids are more active, some kids are less, some kids are more emotionally intense, some are less emotionally intense and kind of placid. These are all just legitimate, it takes all kinds to make a world, and these are all legitimate differences that we can pathologize. I am a clinician, but I'm not medically oriented or pathologically oriented. I tend to depathologize things as often as I can.
Right. It seems to me that sometimes we do pick our complementary, our opposite. Because, for example, for me, I'm very J. My son is very P. He's much more expressive and emotionally volatile. I'm real even, Kevin, Steven. So I think that sometimes our spirits attract that because we need the balance.
Yeah, we do, sure. And we marry people we always tend to marry people that are going to be challenging for us in some ways and that are going to provoke us to grow if we possibly can.
We
do that. We're always trying to grow.
How do you and your wife challenge each other?
Well, I'd say she's much more emotionally intense and physically kind of connected to her body in an emotional way. She's a dancer and a sculptor. And she's just embodied in a way that I'm a little more likely to kind of float off the ground and lose touch with my physical reality. And so I pull her out and she grounds me, and we work out ways to try to be a good team in that sense, and vex each other sometimes.
I have a monthly radio show, and I did one this week with a couple who've been married for 66 years. It's just
Oh, yeah.
amazing to me. And one that was married almost 50 years. And they were so cute because they said, "Oh yes, sex is really a good way to kind of smooth things over." So the woman that was 80,
Yeah.
89, I thought, all right.
Yeah, absolutely. I won't go into the details, but I totally relate to that. And we're going on 54 years, so
Wow.
we've been at it for a long time. And I say it gets, certainly in our case, it gets better and better.
That is inspiring. Because it always seems to me that being with one person that long would be boring. But you're telling me it's not boring.
I think if you're with one person a long time, you both change so much that you might as well have had 6 different marriages, because if everybody's growing and changing, which hopefully you do, things get real different over time. I'd say our relationship and us as people are quite different than we were when we were kids and got married.
And having kids
So,
leave and come be born and then leave, that changes marriages a lot, I think.
yeah, absolutely. And luckily, two of our children are back in the area now after having lived far away for a good however long that lasts. That's real nice. It's nice to have them come back too for a while.
Oh yeah.
Everything changes.
Tell me about your family's attitudes towards religion and spirituality that has influenced your thinking. I know your mother had experiences with precognitive insights. Could you tell us about that?
My mother especially was probably the more spiritual of the two. Her insights, he didn't go that way so much himself temperamentally, but she would have odd ESP type experiences from time to time that were always very intriguing to me. But they were both active in the Protestant church, Methodist church, but I don't think actually it was ever quite as important to them as it was to me. I kind of took to it early and had a kind of mystical bent that was seemed to come natural for me. And I think that my relationship, with both my parents, both of them liked that, respected it, didn't necessarily totally share it, but just a relationship with a larger level of reality. My mother certainly sympathized with and had herself a great deal. She was very spiritual, had a lot of occasionally would have visions that would, as you say, seem to tell her that was really intriguing to me as a kid. I think that if I was going to say something about my parents and how they influenced me, their relationship in law, and I could never exactly figure out why so many things were going.
Wait. You
And
blurred out, so I couldn't understand because it got garbled. You said the way my parents influenced me was.
Well, two things. One is the relationship was rather dysfunctional in a lot of ways, and it wasn't very clear why or why certain things seemed to be so insoluble. And the other, that was a major mystery they gave me that I've ended up pursuing my whole life. How do people tick? Why do they not get along when they don't? What do people really need from each other? These are questions that have really preoccupied me as a psychologist and a therapist. And the other, I think, mystery that they gave me was my other psychic experiences. and they intrigued me and puzzled me and made me feel skeptical, and so that as a teenager, when I hit J.B. Rhine's books on parapsychology, I thought, wow, here's a neat thing. This is an avenue to understanding these things in a scientific way, where you can actually count on the answers. I've always been about equal measure skeptic and mystic. Those two things somehow are very blended in me. And so I love the idea of science, which is why I ended up going to Duke to college, because that's where J.B. Rhine was.
What's an example of your mystical bent when you were a child, and what's an example of your mother's insights?
I think I have memories as a small child when we lived in El Paso, walking around in the desert and talking to God. And God didn't exactly talk back, but I had the strong sense that God was listening and somehow paying attention to everything. It was very comforting. And just seemed real to me, so when people in church would talk about God, it would seem intuitively reasonable to me. I lost all that later when I got smarter and realized that it was all, and I got way away from that.
Okay, it garbled. Excuse me, it garbled after you said I got away from that, and
when I got more educated and had a lot of smart friends who were totally skeptical, I sort of put aside that side of life for a long time and only picked it up again years later. An example of my mother, my dogs are barking. An example of my mother's, well, once when we were in El Paso, my dad was out of work and the family was pretty desperate, which I didn't understand as a child. But she had an experience. She kind of was exhausted one day and collapsed in a chair. And when she opened her eyes, she saw this, I guess she hallucinated, this man in a business suit who looked like Santa Claus. And this man said, "Don't worry, you're going to be moving to a town that's two towns that are divided by a river that has no water." And then he disappeared. And for some reason, my mother was very comforted by this nonsensical stuff this vision said. And at some point, I guess a couple of weeks maybe, or a month, I don't know, later, my dad they forgot all about it. She told my dad. He took these ideas seriously from her because she had these experiences sometimes. And he found a job in Las Vegas, New Mexico. So we moved there. And after they got there, they remembered her vision because the way Las Vegas was, it's an odd history to the town, but it wasn't a big town, 13,000 people, but it was actually two separate municipalities because of the separate histories of the town, separate city governments and fire departments and so forth, and they were divided by the Guyanas River, and the Guyanas River never has water in it, almost. So it was a town that was two towns divided by a river with no water. And that's maybe the most memorable, but it's one of many things that would happen to her occasionally. And sometimes they would be like riddles like that, and then they would kind of unfold themselves later.
What happened? Go ahead. What happened?
No, that was all.
What happened when you said that you kind of went away from the spiritual focus and then you regained interest in it later? What triggered that renewed interest?
A period of profound unhappiness. I was just, I can't say why I got so depressed, but I did. And I just felt like my life wasn't very fulfilling. I wasn't very good for my family. I wasn't that good for myself. And I think I felt miserable enough that I decided to consider a prayer life again. And one reason I've gotten away from that, I spent a lot of years working in therapy with psychotic people. And one thing about psychotic people is that some of them spend way too much time talking to God, and often they will think God's telling them very terrible things. And I think that kind of deepened my fear of indulging that sort of experience. Some of our mass shooters, if you get detailed information about how they think about, we see that sometimes somebody in their head seems to be telling them to do terrible things. And so I've known enough people like that and worked very intensely with a number of them that I got kind of scared of myself that way. And so I don't know, anyway, when I got back to it, I thought, I'll just try this as an experiment. If it hurts me, I'll stop. And if it doesn't hurt me, I'll keep it up. And it actually deepened my life enormously and has continued to grow and has made my life enormously better and me more effective as a person, I think. I should say one thing here. One thing that was a bridge for this to me was all the years I've spent doing parapsychological research, because I always did experiments on other people to see if I could get evidence of ESP and if I could get interesting correlations between their performance and something else that I thought might be important. And this was very fruitful. I've had a lot of luck with research, and I've had a lot of interesting findings, and it kept happening and seemed to be very, very meaningful. And at one point I got in a study in which I was also one of the subjects. I wasn't just an experimenter on the outside. We had a group which would meet weekly, and we would function as a kind of leaderless support group or encounter group, as we just have a relationship with each other, talk about whatever we want to talk about with each other, develop our relationship. And the only difference between this group and every other group like that is that while we were meeting, a computer was randomly selecting a picture as a target. And what we were hoping was that now into our behavior, which gets back to my theory that I'll talk about in a minute, I guess. That made sense to me theoretically in terms of ideas I was developing. And I think we'd have our session. At the end of the session, we would get a phone call which would give us the number of an envelope out of 100 envelopes. Every envelope had 4 pictures. So we would take out that envelope, spread out those 4 pictures, and vote which of the pictures most resembles the session we just had. If that picture had been some kind of implicit prime for our session, which would have been the best match? And what we found was that we could pick out the picture over and over and over without having a reason to do it. In other words, we were managing unconsciously to get a picture into our experience. Well, I mean, this was fun and exciting, but our success was so good that it a little bit freaked me out because I realized that I was one of the ones who was most producing these correspondences. So that line between the experimenter and the participant went away. And that opened up a period of a couple of weeks in which I was just real psychic. I was just knowing things before they happened. It was fascinating and a little disorienting. Certainly the most opened up I'd ever been up to that point, that way. And so somehow the way this was a bridge back to considering a spiritual life again is that clearly there's more to us than what we see on the surface, and clearly there are more connections between us and some other level of reality than our normal assumptions admits. And if that's true, which I think we then it opens up the possibility of something like a spiritual life being a real thing. I don't know if I'm being clear, but that's the way it felt to me at that time.
What's an example of a picture that matched a conversation topic? And was that group at Duke?
It was at the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man. He took his lab off campus and made it an independent institute. Called it the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man.
This is Ryan.
And it took place in that institute. And also in my practice office in Chapel Hill. So we would select the targets at FRNM while we were meeting in Chapel Hill, 20 miles away. So there was quite a distance, physical distance between us and the targets. And so an example, well, there was a session early on in which one of the members was, I've had a lot of experience in Gestalt therapy, and sometimes I would encourage kind of Gestalt exercises in the group, although as the group developed, I got to where I didn't do that anymore. But at that point, I remember he was kind of restless, but very intense, and didn't seem to know what he wanted to say, and he was pacing around the room, and I said, "Do something now." And he went and stood behind a bald-headed man in the group, an older man that he admired. I knew that he admired him. And he patted his bald head. And why did he do that? He didn't know why he did that. But it was a meaningful act, and it was kind of fun, and it was all in this spirit. It was a very spontaneous kind of active group session.
Right.
And playful. And turned out the target that day was a big bull with a bull in a china shop. So the bull is kind of charging around and not being kind of reckless, which is kind of the way he was being. And the bull has this big, it's a top view, and we see the top of the bull's head, which is bald and round, with an X in the middle of it. Why the person made the picture like that, I don't know. It was just taken out of the magazine. But it's like X marks the spot, which is what this guy's behavior was. So it was a real nice, if we had to have a pictorial representation of this really dramatic moment in this session, that would have been a perfect representation. And there were a number of matches like that. Some of them were more subtle. For example, one day there was, the talk drifted along to talk about mortality and loss, and some people had some poignant experiences that they shared. And somebody told a story, I don't remember what it was exactly, that implied being kind of bereft after some loss. And the target that day was of a house on a beach that had been gutted by a hurricane. And the floor was, obviously had been flooded with water, everything was gone, everything was ruined. So again, it was, if we had to have a pictorial representation of that session, that was the perfect one. And the other three pictures were the dummies in the set were clearly did not bear that kind of relationship.
So
and that's what we found over. We did quite well as a group identifying the target.
What was the percentage of your hit rate?
I don't remember now. I think the main way we looked at it was, did the correct target get ranked first or second versus third or fourth? We divided them into two, because that's the way they were doing it at the FRNM at that time. So chance would be 50%. And it seems like our hit, I'd have to check, but it was way statistically significant. We found some interesting correlations too. We rated every session at the end, and in terms of a number of qualities of the session. And it turned out that when sessions were more intense and especially more conflicted, our scoring dropped to chance.
Oh, that's interesting. You weren't coherent.
I think, and when sessions were more playful and more spontaneous and more
relaxed,
lighter, and the interactions were freer, kind of, not so fraught with something, then we scored super well. So the correlations were very meaningful too, I thought.
Do you do like a meditation practice, or when you pray, what may I ask, what kind of structure or format or approach that you use?
Well, it varies. I just make sure I have hopefully an hour at the beginning of every day for a very quiet period, and in which I can just kind of clear out and get in touch with sort of a higher, better order of things, and get a sense of guidance. And sometimes I'll do Gestalt work, like Fritz Perls used to do, in the sense that I might take some troubling situation and imagine that person in a chair beside me and have a bit of a dialogue, and I'll find that that'll work out in terms of that relationship. So it'll go in many different directions, but I just need an hour, hopefully a half hour anyway, of quiet time to work in an inward way.
Do you sit, or can you walk, or do you need to just sit quietly?
I'd say 80% sitting, 20% walking. I live in the woods, and I'll good. But more times than not, it's just me in a chair.
Got it. Roughly how old were you when you had your dark night of the soul, when you were really depressed for no clear reason?
Late 40s.
So it was kind of a midlife crisis.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've never been a heavy drinker, but I think I was drinking some then too, and that clearly wasn't good for me or anybody else. And got clear about stopping that, which I'm doing very little anymore. Yeah, I think I was a little confused about where my life was going in terms of my career. I had thought I'd been a college professor for a number of years at UNC, and then left that, and which was good in some ways because it let me focus clinically, where I was kind of in a way more natural than I was. And it let me focus all my research interests on parapsychology, which was the thing I really cared about. Whereas in my academic department, there had been a lot of criticism of that and constraints on that. And, I was interested in other things and did other work, but that was always kind of a burning interest in me, the parapsychology stuff. And but I felt a little lost for a while after that, and then it was great to find a way to pull out of that.
It's a big shift in identity to leave academia and be Professor Carpenter. It's an identity shift.
Absolutely. Yeah, very much. It turned out to be way the best thing that could have happened, but that's the kind of thing you can only see in retrospect.
Yeah, right. I'm curious about your dissertation about mother-daughter communication. What did you find, and why were you interested in that?
During that period, I was very taken with the family communication theories of mental illness and psychopathology, and I think the approach that most intrigued me was R.D. Laing's ideas about confirmation and disconfirmation and families and psychosis. And I think all that actually has a lot of substance to it, and it's been way dismissed in recent years because psychiatry's gone so medical that all those ideas have pretty much been forgotten by most psychiatrists now.
That's sad.
But intrigued with that, and so I did a study of normal girls and mothers communicating with each other, and looked at how confirming the mothers were in their responses and how revealing the daughters were in their disclosures when the two of them were talking together, and I analyzed their communications. And I looked at some personality matters of both and found some, I ended up never publishing any of that. I had 3 papers out of that were in the works at the time I left UNC, and I never went back to it and published them. But I found some interesting things that certainly would have been worth reporting by someone else, but I kind of lost interest at that point.
Did you find that what traits in the mother encouraged the daughter to be more open and disclosive?
Well, how confirming the mother was in the sense of how was genuinely receptive to the communications of the daughter. that was a very, very strong predictor of how disclosing the girl was.
Well, that makes sense.
And yeah. And I had a situation where I measured how confirming the mother was with a Confederate, someone not her daughter. No, not a Confederate, it was another daughter. It was someone else's daughter. So I had mothers talking with their own daughters and mothers talking with someone else's daughter. And looked at those different situations. And it turns out that the trait of being confirming on the mother's part was nicely correlated with the trait of being revealing on the daughter's part, which is common sense. You wouldn't, not something you'd be hugely surprised by, but I don't think anyone had demonstrated it before that. And that's one of the things that came out that would have been worth reporting, but like I say, I never did.
You know, what would be interesting to study is that there's books about how when teenage boys hit adolescence, they stop having supportive close friends and they're kind of left out in left field with no one to really talk with. It would be interesting to know where those boys find support or someone they can talk to. Do you have any sense of that?
Start the beginning of that, please. Now, when boys do what? That puts them out on?
The studies show that when boys hit adolescence, then they back off from close friendships because they think it could be gay or they could be weird or something. So they're left pretty isolated. I forgot the name of the book about this, and so I'm wondering if you've come across anything that shows what allows a boy to be disclosive.
Well, I think their family history is going to show itself later. This is interesting. I'm not familiar with that book you mentioned, and that research, it certainly does sound interesting. And it rings true in terms of families I've worked with. I think there's a period when boys kind of leave relationships because their main need is their individual identity. And it doesn't exactly work this way normatively with girls. Girls may go through this too, but most times boys are going to do it at that age more than girls are. They're going to go read Stephen and think that's it, or they're going to read, Catcher in the Rye, and they're going to identify with it and think, yes, I'm an alienated youth, I'm all by myself. And it's a period I think boys go through as they're trying to figure out who they're going to be. And in a sense, they don't need people in the same way at that point. They need to kind of get away from everybody. And when they find their way back to people, it's usually because they fall in love with somebody. And when they fall in love with somebody, they have to figure out how to relate again, which they often don't know much about doing. And that's quite a challenge.
It's interesting that Native Americans send the boys off to a vision quest, so they go off by themselves in a ritual way.
I know, that's a wonderful ritual. And we have our similar things. Unfortunately, some of our rituals really go awry. Like so many boys will into drugs at that point, with this kind of romantic idea that if I trip out, I'm going on a vision quest of some sort, and I'll listen to lots and lots of heavy metal, I wish we had those more benign rituals than the ones we have. Or, it'd be nice if we could have culturally sanctioned rituals, but we don't. It's kind of each kid for himself, unfortunately, right there. And the music industry and the mass media and so forth give us rituals, and I suppose kids pick those up and use them and become fans of a rock group or something and somehow use that as their transition.
That's
nowadays.
true. Then they become they're punk or they're emo or they're R&B or whatever their identity becomes their music choice. That's interesting. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
You've done over 80,000 therapy sessions. I wonder if there's patterns in terms of what people, why they come to you. I mean, I'm sure that their marriage isn't working, they're having trouble communicating with their kids, or what do you find are the themes?
Oh, goodness. There's so many themes. I think one thing that's happened in recent years is that there are a lot of ways we can say the world is going to hell and be very despairing and everything, but actually it doesn't really, to tell you the truth. I do think some good things are developing. I think that people, say compared to when I was in my 20s and 30s, people are taking their relationships very seriously. And they're taking on more responsibility for making them work. Instead of just running off to somebody else. And that's a good development. I'm seeing now a lot of people whose parents were divorced and these about divorce. They know how hard it is, and they really try to work hard. And when couples come in to see me, they're trying to work real hard on the relationships. There's a depth of seriousness about it that's a little better than, say, in the 60s and 70s when everybody was kind of more selfish, I think. And they're not so much. They're interested in figuring out how to make things work. And I appreciate that, and that gives me a lot to work with as a therapist. Now, when people come in individual therapy now, are there any other patterns? People are depressed or they're anxious. A lot of people come in now knowing their psychiatric diagnosis because they've seen psychiatrists and they're on some kind of medication, and so they'll tell me they'll give me their DSM label and they'll tell me I'm that, and I often have to go through a period of trying to get under that and say, well, yeah, but let's assume you just have the disease of humanity and see what's going on inside your life, and then. People need to talk. They need to be understood. Sometimes they'll need somebody to fight with and to kind of bounce up against and test. Therapy's full of tests. So the therapist tries to pass tests, if possible, tries to figure them out and pass them. Has that changed a lot? I don't know. It's pretty perennial, I think. This is probably what people are being seen, therapists and counselors and priests and wise uncles and stuff forever.
Freud called it projection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Freud called it projection. So you project on your therapist.
Oh yeah, you totally,
Transference.
Projection, yeah. You take your issues and put them on the therapist, and hopefully the therapist can help make something useful out of that. That's what you try to do.
You say that mental illness, it's not a brain disease. It's not just a chemical imbalance. You are criticizing, I think, the oversimplification of, you're bipolar, so we'll give you lithium and that'll solve it. So tell us more about what mental illness is.
Well, I don't mean to diminish how ill people can be. That is, say if you're depressed, you can be so ill that you die of it. And so it's a deadly serious illness. I'm not saying that there's no such thing as psychological illness. But I do think that if we try to reduce all that to brain chemistry, we lose the meaning in symptoms. Why is someone so depressed? What does it mean? When did it start? What loss does it have to do with it? What anger does it have to do with? If someone's anxious, it's not just brain chemicals or bad conditioning. It has meaning, often a mysterious meaning. And in therapy, you try to crack those mysteries open and see what things mean. I just like to approach these things as if they're meaningful rather than meaningless. And if we reduce everything to biochemistry, this strongly implies that all these experiences are meaningless. And that's tragic. They're not meaningless. They're full of meaning if they can be understood compassionately, and if the person himself can understand them compassionately. Then you can work toward a deeper kind of solution. You may not be Pollyanna happy, but you're going to be a lot more real, and you're going to be capable of more happiness when situation in your life merits it, and people can work toward better lives. One thing about medication, if you just depend on it, is that a lot of our medications take. I'm sounding down on medication, and I'm just down on it as an exclusive way of understanding things. But they're also great. They save lives. They help people live. They help people relate. They're terribly useful sometimes. But if you just say live on an antidepressant, what it does is it takes your emotional life and it keeps it inside sort of a narrow band, so that you never feel too much in any direction. And what you're taking away from a person when you do that is we've all inherited this nervous system that's exquisitely attuned to change. And we're capable of reacting with excitement when there's something to be excited about, reacting with pain and anguish when there's some tragedy, by running real fast when there's a danger, fighting when there's an attack. You know, our natural emotional life goes all over the place in response to things happening to us. And what you do when you confine emotion to that band is that you take away that person's emotional flexibility, and they can kind of start to drift through life. Like, well, things aren't too bad, but nothing's changed for 5 years, and sort of, hey, it doesn't bother me though, and it can lead you to a kind of lack of responsiveness that, if you look at the whole lifespan, isn't that terrific for a person?
Right. You, in one of your articles, you made a connection between ESP and anxiety. So I didn't understand the correlation.
It's negative. And I draw this mostly from the research, and the research is very consistent in this, and it's a major aspect of my theory at first sight. What happens when we're frightened is our band of attention shrinks, and so the world we respond to gets very, very narrow. This is another kind of narrow. So I don't mean emotional breadth, I mean our attention. We only attend to what we're afraid of at that moment, and things that are associated with what we're afraid of.
Yeah.
And the mind is automatically screening out everything else in the world. And since an ESP stimulus, or it's not a stimulus, but an ESP target is outside that X that I'm afraid of, it's among all those things that are screened out. And so people that are very anxious tend to score not a chance in ESP tests, but below chance. That is, they actually reject this distant information. And again, that's functional because they're so focused on the object of their fear, which is what we do when we're scared.
Yeah, it makes sense. In First Sight, your book that was published in 2012, you say that to talk about parapsychology is really not accurate. We should get rid of the para because access to this external guidance is in fact can be very supportive and helpful. And my feeling is, in terms of evolution, people who had that kind of access were the ones who survived and passed on their genes. So it's evolutionarily useful to be sensitive to information.
Yeah, the only place I differ from what you just said is that I think this is actually going on all the time for everyone. Yeah. I don't think there are some people that are more psychic than other people. I think it's actually an unconscious process that's happening all the time for all of us. That's why I call it first sight. But it's unconscious. And yes, I think probably long ago in the evolutionary chain, organisms developed a very broad span of responsiveness, both specializing within their sensory domain, things they can see, touch, smell, whatever senses they've got, focusing there because that's the most highly defined information. But also, when it's needed, having a much broader range of contact with reality beyond our senses. We don't see that every day, but I think it's going on, and in the right circumstances, we can see it. I think in my theory, I spell out what I think the researchers learned, and also what research in other parts of psychology have learned about how the mind samples unconscious information. And there are definite patterns that cut across a lot of areas of research. One is that, say, take my mother's state of mind when she had this man who looked like Santa Claus. She was totally worn out, which meant that she wasn't cognitively working on anything. She was exhausted. Because cognitive work, like anxiety, screens out unconscious material. Cognitive work focuses on what it's focusing on. The tighter our focus is, the less use we make of things that are unconscious. We see that in subliminal perception research. We see that in creativity research. So she had no cognitive work going on. At the same time, there was something she urgently needed to know. She urgently needed to know if there was any reason to have hope for the future. And the only place she could find any response to that urgent need was outside of her sensory domain. It was from this pool of potential knowledge, which is bigger than us and which we can't really characterize because it's unconscious. And maybe it's friendly. She believed it was friendly, loving, and this loving, friendly source of information gave her this riddle that was very comforting and in fact told her about the future. So she had the urgent need, which is a vital thing. It's real important. It's real necessary. So the mind's looking for it. It'll look for it wherever it can. There's nowhere in the present it can find it. there's nowhere in the room that there's anything to be hopeful about at that moment. So she reaches beyond the room. And there's no cognitive work around this thing now. So two important ingredients in when these things emerge. And I think that's the case for everybody, actually, not just for people who seem to have more of these experiences. I think what's happening when someone's more psychic is they're interested in this level of experience, they're kind of temperamentally and habitually open to it, and so they consult it more. And when it happens, they take it more seriously. I think probably these kind of contingencies pop up in other people's lives too, but they're really easy to forget and dismiss. They make no sense. It's like, do you pay attention to your dreams? Most people don't pay attention to their dreams because they seem so stupid, and so they immediately forget them. On the other hand, if you're a person who's gotten used to getting interesting information from your dreams, you'll pay more attention to them. You'll write them down, and when they correspond with the future, you'll notice it. And is that person a psychic dreamer? Yeah, indeed, sometimes. More than other people? Well, we don't know. What we know is they pay more attention to it.
Do you think that this source of inspiration and information is neutral, or do you think it has, your mother thought it had a benign influence? In other words, is it just like this quantum field of information, or is it like spirit guides that are helping us through life or something? Is it neutral or benign?
You know, that's so much what we make it to be. I do think if we act on the assumption that it's benign or even loving, that opens up experience, that has different consequences than if we assume that it's just a neutral storehouse of it. That assumption can open things up nicely too, but I think in the end maybe a little less richly than if you make the assumption, if you project the belief that it's personal and loving. Then I think it will respond in kind. I mean, the universe responds a lot in terms of what we project upon it. If we project a nasty universe full of danger and mean people and mean forces, we'll have a lot of bad experiences. We'll tend to get back what we project out. And I think if we project out the more benign things, we're much more likely to get a very happy kind of help.
Quantum physicists say it's not fair to say that quantum non-locality of entangled particles that communicate with each other, it's not fair to say that that's an information field because we really don't know how they connect with each other. What's your understanding if there's any quantum mechanics explanation of how we access information from the future or that we don't know?
Well, you know, I might as well give you an opinion about world politics or something. I mean, we are so outside of my range of expertise there that I try to follow. I'm no physicist, and I made a decision in college, actually, to study psychology rather than either physics or medicine because I was so much more interested in the mind, and that's just determined what I've learned about and thought about and read about and so forth. So I am such a naive novice at physics. I read some of the popular science physics accounts, and And I think they're fascinating, and I try to follow them, but I don't have an informed opinion on that question. I sure hope those people work something interesting out. I think people like Ed May or Brian Josephson are full of wonderful, fruitful ideas, and I'm standing in the wings, cheering them on, but I'm in no position to say anything about it.
Well, you were the head of Rhine for a while and did a lot of experiments there. What are some of the experiments that convinced you that we really are the recipients of this subconscious, unconscious information download?
There's so many experiments. I wouldn't know where to start. I mean, my own experience with that group study is one, but I'd say that parapsychology in general is a bizarrely well-kept secret in science. So much good science has accumulated over places. And what I try to do in First Sight is pull a lot of that together and put it under a single set of concepts to try to make sense of it and relate it to what's going on in other parts of science. But I'd say, for example, all the research on personality and ESP, relationships with anxiety, relationships with extroversion, relationships with creativity. These are all growing lines of study that don't always perfectly replicate, but even the non-replications tend to make sense. And like any area of science, they accumulate and grow. And if you stand back and look at the whole field, which I'm in a position to do because I've kept up with it all these years, it's astonishing how much good work has been done and how little it's known.
Yeah.
There's something, the way the world is, the way our culture is put together right now, gives a huge blind spot to this field. And it's something I've been puzzling by ever since I came to school as an undergraduate. And I would spend time in the psych department where I'd be told that there's nothing to parapsychology. And then I would spend time at Ryan's lab where these people fascinating work and getting these really cool, strong results, and then it'd be replicated in New York or it'd be replicated in Paris. And then I'd go back to the psychology department and be told that nothing was going on and there was nothing to it and these people were frauds and cheats. And so I get to know Ryan, scrupulous, self-critical people I've ever known in my life. They were crazy self-critical. And so it's been a bizarre conjunction to be, say, an academic psychologist and straddle that line, to be a clinical psychologist. Although clinicians tend to be generally open to parapsychology.
Because they see it in their practice?
A lot of clinicians. Yeah, no, I don't know. They tend to be more open-minded people to begin with than people that focus just on the sciences of psychology or neurology or whatever. They're more interested in people as they actually are and actually live their lives, and so they're just more open in general. And if you're more open, you see a lot of this, not all the time, but certainly from time to time. I went off on a little rant there. I even forgot where we started.
Well, what I'm interested in is what's the experiential evidence, experimental evidence that convinces you that we do have this kind of unconscious access to information coming in, and that it can bleed into the future, like your mother's precog visions. What's the evidence for it? And you've given us some.
Yeah. Well, Well, there are many lines of work. I think I'm convinced if the lines of work replicate. A critical criterion in science to believe that anything is real is to have it replicated.
Yeah.
And to have it meaningfully in other forms, in other places, by other people. And say, for example, the Gonsfeld work, where you've got two people in two separate soundproof rooms, and they're separated from each other, and one is watching a videotape, and the other one is spaced out and free-associating into a microphone. And you do this for 20 minutes, and then the person who's been doing the free-associating tries to pick out the decoys. And they can do it to a degree, and do it over and over and over in many different labs, many different things, many different subjects. So in general, it can be replicated. And there are a number of areas of research that are this strong. That's one. I'm very interested too, say once you have a Gestalt, once you have the Gonsfeld, when does it work better? When does it not work so well? And I did some research at one point where I took hundreds of these sessions that had been transcribed, where the free associations are transcribed, and then and analyze them in terms of content categories. For example, implications in the speech of anxiety, or there are verbal implications of being especially open and kind of in a harmonious state of mind, where there are indications of doing a lot of cognitive analysis while the person's speaking. And all this was coded by raters. And I found, for example, that when there were these implicit suggestions of anxiety, people were less likely to hit the target. When there were more of these implicit indications of kind of a state of harmony and merger, they tended more to hit the target. When there were indications that they were analyzed, that tended to miss the target, and so forth. So I had a number of dimensions that correlated with the target in ways that were very meaningful. And I took this to a new sample of transcribed Gonsfeld sessions from other laboratories in 3 or 4 different countries, and found exactly the same patterns. So it was a very nice replication. The patterns I found in one set of studies replicated in another. So in as much as I was able to capture something about the participant's state of mind, those things hold up over time. Yes, indeed, those states of mind are helpful if you want access to this kind of information. And so every time we find those patterns and repeat them and then repeat them again, our confidence grows. And over 100 years of research, we have a lot of lines of work that way. And more than just simple belief that it's real, this is why I tried to develop the first sight theory. I think there are clear patterns to these findings that if we can kind of conceptually grasp them, can guide our research much more fruitfully, which is why I developed that theory in an attempt to guide future research and to connect it to research going on in social psychology, cognitive psychology, neuropsychology, other fields of mainstream research, where patterns are the same. They're really the same.
What do you think of the Monroe Institute induces this kind of psi phenomena with by stimulation of the brain with sound. I mean, what I'm really asking is, do you think we can teach people to be more open to downloading information?
You know, I don't know about that. To tell you the truth, this may be just my ignorance speaking here, but I don't know of any actually scientifically validated methods of making people do better. I don't know of any, including Monroe. I hear a lot of interesting stories from people who've been to Monroe and taken part in those workshops, and they're very dramatic anecdotes sometimes, but what we're lacking is a kind of research that actually demonstrates that and repeats it. I don't think, like any practical situation, research is a secondary concern, I imagine, but it would be very helpful to have more studies that would let us actually draw that conclusion. So I don't know of any really well-validated method of teaching people to do these things better.
I was trained in the Berkeley Psychic Institute tools. I went to classes in Chico for three nights a week for a year, and I think what worked about those is that you would focus on something like a rose was their symbol, so it'd keep your left brain busy, and then you could be whole brain because your left rose was looking at this symbol. So it was a way to just keep the mind busy so you could access information. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes all kind of sense, and I actually don't doubt that there's a lot of promise in that. I just would like to see the funds and the time devoted to really demonstrating that in a scientific way.
I know. I don't know how you do it. I know that before I did the training.
We just have to put the time and resources into doing it. I think it could be done and be very exciting to do it. It'll actually be very exciting.
Well, I teach.
The research often feels like a drag to people that are so excited about the experience that's developing for them. They're not that interested in demonstrating it in a study.
Well, if you ever want to do it, I teach people, and I use my book about essential energy tools, how to develop your clairvoyant and healing abilities, and I teach them how to turn it on. So if you can ever think of a way to measure the before and after of their abilities to be intuitive, I volunteer.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. You know, Joe McMonagle also does some wonderful teaching.
Who?
Of remote viewing. Joe McMonagle, the remote viewer. He follows, I think, somewhat similar principles and does some very good teaching in his workshops, and I'd love to see some studies done with some of these things. You know, one thing about parapsychology, as much progress as it's made, Louisa Ryan did an analysis a number of years ago where she took all of the person hours that had accumulated in all the parapsychology studies up to that point, and they equaled the amount of research done in a major psychology department in towards 30 years. We have almost no resources, and for such a small group, spread so thin with so little money, we've done an amazing amount of work. But in terms of the actual hours we've been able to put into this, it's tiny, tiny, tiny. So tiny compared to the questions. It's really a vexing situation that way. I mean, there's some places that manage to eke out good research, like what stands out to me is Dean Radin's group at IONS continues to be very productive in terms of research, and they do it on a shoestring. And I'd say Chris Rowe's group in the UK, his department.
What university?
Oh, I think he's at Northampton.
Is Chris Rhodes? How do you spell Rhodes?
ROE.
Oh, okay. And there's University of Virginia Consciousness Studies.
Yeah, those. I wish those guys published more. They sure work hard, and they do a lot of work. It kind of, most of it seems to go into a black box, and it's hard to get at it. But when they do publish, it's extremely interesting, and I think they're quite productive. They're just not so much focused on reporting as they are on doing the research, which is, of course, the fun part for any scientist.
Gary Schwartz at University of Arizona.
I'm sorry?
Gary Schwartz at University of Arizona.
Absolutely. His place has been very productive. And yeah, that's one of the few. And the Rhine Center, which is what FRNM became, is small but productive. So there are a few places managing to get out some work, but there are very few.
What's your future direction? Do you have another book in the hopper waiting to be born?
I've been working on a somewhat more approachable, somewhat more popular version of my first psych book that's about half done. I've also been doing some more clinical writing. I've got a book on early memories that is pretty much finished and looking for a publisher. It's not parapsychology, but it's how to get the meaning out of kind of marginal experiences. And I'm doing some other more clinical writing. So I've always kind of balanced these two interests in my life, and I'm still doing that. I'm still doing writing in both fields.
What do you do for fun?
Right. I suppose, spend time with my family. To read and write. I'm a reader and writer. I also write poetry and fiction. I have a wonderful writing group that is probably one of the most fun things I do.
Have you published your fiction?
Yeah, I published some a long time ago. I haven't published any. I've got a couple pieces out to some magazines now. We'll see. I've just started trying to publish in those areas. Yeah. Coming out soon in a magazine, and I've kept working at those things all these years, but I haven't tried to publish in many years. I'd say back in the 70s I published some because that's what I was sort of trying to, but I haven't tried to in many years. I've been working on other things so much.
When you're writing fiction, do you find that you kind of give yourself up to your characters? And because I've heard some fiction writers say the characters just start taking over and they set the pace.
Yeah, they do. And they do the darndest things. And say terrible things sometimes and take you strange places. Absolutely. If you let that go, they will go.
Where do you think that comes from, the same kind of information field as paranormal stuff that you're kind of channeling? Yeah.
Yeah, I totally think it does. I think it absolutely does. If you read in First Sight, my book on creativity and psych, I talk about that conjunction in there. And more creative people that are actually doing effective creative work in the arts, generally are going to perform better on parapsychological research. I think, they're tapping the same place.
And you somehow also tie in memory to psi. So, because memory comes from the unconscious and psi comes from the unconscious, is that what they share?
Yes. But you need to divide memory up into two major parts. People that study memory, there's a huge literature on memory. I think you might say it's been the major preoccupation of experimental psychology from the beginning has been learning, how learning works. And I think long-term memory, which is kind of sits in the background and isn't on our mind, is the part of memory that functions a lot like psi. Now, short-term memory, or what we call working memory, is a very different thing because it's an active cognitive process that focuses my attention right now. And so if I'm trying to remember your phone number, it's kind of, those little wheels keep turning because I'm trying not to let go of those numbers. And when working memory is going on, psi is going to be rejected. When I'm asked to access long-term memory, what did I do last Tuesday morning? And if I kind of reach back and try to find that, it's very much like opening up a space inside in which some ESP information is able to pop in.
You're listening. It's kind of passive rather than active in a way.
That's the point. Whereas when I'm involved in work, anything, I'm focusing on what I'm trying to, my little task. And so if you look at the research on ESP and memory seemed very contradictory because a lot of positive correlations were reported and a lot of negative correlations were reported. And First Sight theory says that cognitive work should exclude psi, and an open, like you say, listening frame of mind should get better access to psi. And so if you divide those memory studies up into working memory studies versus long-term memory studies or procedural memory studies, you can really divide those correlations. All the negative correlations come in when it was working memory that was being studied. All the positive correlations come in when it was long-term memory or procedural memory that was being studied, which makes sense theoretically and common sense too.
Sometimes it feels like that my fingers on the keyboard are necessary for the process of writing something logical, that it's somehow the tactile sense gets involved. Do you have that feeling too?
I never thought about it before.
It's like it gets things going.
Say more what you mean.
Well, if I'm taking a walk and thinking about something that I'm writing, I'll get certain insights. But if I sit down on the keyboard with my fingers, then it allows it to flow, and it encourages or enables the process. Just the tactile fingers on the keyboard. because I'm so used to writing that way.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying totally rings true. I would say that describes my experience too. Especially if I let a kind of flow develop. If I'm thinking, analyzing in my head, then, that process does better than flow. My fingers have trouble keeping up. And I and the keyboard become kind of one thing.
Yeah.
The keyboard is like my fingers, kind of. There's not much of a line between them.
And they're part of your brain, kind of.
Yeah.
So they're all connected.
Yeah, we all flow together.
We're like cyborgs.
Absolutely.
Okay. I did want to ask you about, you said you're not an expert on the world political scene, but I did want to ask you about it because so many people are so discouraged and worried about Trump and all the other autocrats and climate change. And I wondered how you approach that, if you're optimistic or pessimistic.
I guess in the biggest scheme of things, I'm optimistic. The world does seem to me to be basically a benign thing. If I don't listen to the listen enough, I hope, to have some basic connection. But so many people are so upset, and they're talking about it so much that, and in my clinical hours, I have to deal with other people being upset about their things, that I want periods where nobody's upset so much. And so I don't spend a lot of time thinking about politics. I was delighted that the Democrats took the House. Thank goodness. So that gives me a little bit of short-term optimism. I think I've been reading Michelle Obama's memoir, and she is such a cool person.
Yeah. Becoming.
Person. And what? I'm sorry?
Isn't it Becoming, I think is the title.
Yeah. Great book. Yeah. And one thing it made me remember was how deeply happy I was when Obama was elected.
I cried.
I just tripped out. I was a foot off the sidewalk for a few days. I was so happy. I'd gotten involved in college with sit-ins and civil rights demonstrations in North Carolina, and it was wonderful when Jim Crow actually came down. I mean, everybody was thinking that the world was going to end when this changed, and the world didn't end. They just got rid of some horrible laws, and people were treated a little more decently, and that sort of made me in big term believe in something optimistic. And when Obama was elected, I don't think, even though Trump's trying to undo everything about that, I don't think he can. I don't think anybody can undo that. We're evolving as a society. We're getting better at communicating. It's very rough and ragged, and the internet's crazy. But that's the way it always is. Development is rough, and I think we're developing. And after Trump, we'll do better. Am I just saying things that let me sleep at night? I mean, maybe, but I kind of do believe it.
My last question is, I've been doing a lot of research about global youth, and the studies in the U.S. show that there's been a really major increase in teen anxiety and depression, especially among girls. And I wondered what your observation is as to why there's this increase in anxiety and depression, especially among girls.
It is so hard. Now, girls, you mean
Teen.
Like young girls?
Teenagers.
Older girls.
Adult, high school.
Teenagers, but becoming young women girls. It is so hard to figure out how to be a woman now.
Because you got to be everything. You got to be good looking and sexy and get A's and SATs and good college and great career and yeah.
Yeah, it's, you know, I don't know how they do it, but they keep doing it. But the developmental challenges for young girls are so acute and so complicated, and the world is so shifted and shifting. Day by day, things change. That girls have so many challenges to figure out who they are and how they're going to relate and what they're going to care about and who they're going to belong to and in what way. And I just stand back and, you know, I love working clinically with girls and women, and I've always liked females, even though I've never that well understood them probably. I keep working at it. That's like organization. It's always a work in progress. But I just think the challenges are so great, and I have so much admiration for young women now who are figuring these things out. It's heroic.
Yeah, I agree.
And there are casualties.
Right. Is there anything else that you would like included in your chapter? Have we left out anything that comes to mind that we should include that?
Plug for the science, I guess I've already said that, and I'd like a plug for First Sight Theory as a guide to helping develop the science. That's, to date, I think, what I've most been able to offer parapsychology. So I'd like for people, my book is kind of dense. It was written kind of academically, and if people do pick it up, I would suggest that they skip chapter 2 until the end, because it's especially dense. And I did it that way on purpose, but a lot of people find it off-putting and too much trouble, and I don't really blame them. But if they would skip that, I think the rest is much more accessible and is a good introduction to the field of psychology and to a way of thinking about it. So I'd love for people to make use of that book.
Great.
A plug.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking with you, and I will send you link and transcript, and we will be in touch.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a joy. I hope to meet you in person sometime.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? Okay.
Yeah, that's what I look forward to.
Thank you.